Hey, it's Kay, and this is my lead designer, Skittles. Today, we're gonna talk about Us, the new movie by Jordan Peele, who, if you're like me, you mostly knew as the guy from that really middle-of-the-road sketch show before he wrote, produced, and directed two of your favorite horror films, as a result of possibly the only good decision Blumhouse has ever made as a production company.
We're gonna Drax. Sklounced.
Us is extremely good, and you should watch it. And that concludes the spoiler-free segment of the video. In Us, we follow a fairly well-off family who come to be terrorized by exact copies of themselves. On the initial viewing, the first act of Us plays out like my least favorite horror subgenre, hitting all the beats of the home invasion film. Now, home invasion films typically feature a middle to upper class family being unjustly terrorized by a group of spooky outsiders. Now, those outsiders are significant here. Horror, as a genre, plays on the anxieties of its target audience, and people in cozy, gated communities who might see themselves reflected in the main characters of these films are scared of poor people. Whether it's the working class of their own country or the dreaded foreign poors. And Us was shaping up to just be more of the same. Possibly with the pretense that because the family in question wasn't as rich as their friends, it could alter this dynamic. But sorry, if you own a summer home, you're in a different economic bracket than me, pal. But then, this happens.
Once upon a time, there was a girl, and the girl had a shadow. The two were connected, tethered together. When the girl ate, her food was given to her warm and tasty. But when the shadow was hungry, she had to eat rabbit, raw and bloody. On Christmas, the girl received wonderful toys, soft and cushy. But the shadow's toys were so sharp and cold, they'd slice through her fingers when she tried to play with them. The girl met a handsome prince and fell in love, but the shadow, at that same time, met Abraham. It didn't matter if she loved him or not. He was tethered to the girl's prince after all. And then the girl had her first child, a beautiful baby girl. But the shadow, she gave birth to a little monster. Umbra was born laughing. The girl had a second child, a boy this time. They had to cut her open and take him from her belly, and the shadow had to do it all herself. She named him Pluto. He was born to love fire. So you see, the shadow hated the girl so much for so long, until one day the shadow realized she was being tested by God.
And any suspicion that this was just going to be another fear-mongering home invasion film is dashed, just like that. The relatively well-off are scared of the poor for one simple reason. They know their comfort is only possible because of the suffering of the poor. It's normally left in the subtext of home invasion films to the extent that you wonder if the creator even thought about what they were doing. But what Jordan Peele does in Us is put it right there in the text, which frees him to then explore what that means. Rachel Sherman wrote a book called Uneasy Street: The Anxieties of Affluence. In it, she writes about the results of extensive interviews with dozens of wealthy individuals. She found across the board that these people feel a certain amount of guilt about their wealth. They don't like to flaunt it, they don't even like being associated with the rich. Now, this doesn't bother them enough to give it away, of course, but that guilt sits there, in their subconscious. They understand completely that in this economic system, the existence of haves must surely imply the existence of have-nots. But why live in guilt about it, right? Surely it's easier to go about your day and put it out of sight, out of mind. But when you have an entire class of people who suffer for your luxuries, and you, perhaps for convenience, perhaps for your own psychological well-being, choose to ignore them, to avoid this conflict, that is going to breed resentment between the haves and the have-nots. In Us, everyone has a doppelganger, a clone who is tethered to them and who experiences horrible, warped versions of everything they do. They live isolated, underground in a network of tunnels. When their surface counterparts eat a nice dinner, they feast on raw rabbit with their bare hands. When their surface counterparts get married and have kids, they are seemingly forced to pair up with the copy of their surface doppelganger's partner and have children, which come out as horrifying aberrations. These doppelgangers form a very literal underclass. They live below the surface, they are brought needless suffering for everything good that happens in the lives of the people on the surface. And most importantly, they are invisible to society. People don't know that they're there. Or perhaps they just don't want to know. I mean, they can't even speak. They very literally don't have a voice. Early in the movie, there is a scene that I think perfectly demonstrates the casual ways we choose not to see the inconvenient. The family is in the car listening to I Got Five on It, a song about buying and doing the pot. A fairly normal occurrence for a lot of people, but when you want to listen to it with your nice middle-class family and your 2 kids, it's easier to just pretend you don't know what the song is about. It's not about anything. It's just a dope song. And so, despite everyone in the car knowing the song is about drugs, Gabe, the husband, insists it is not. Later in the movie, Gabe tries to intimidate the tethered doppelgangers of his family. They're standing in the driveway and he goes out twice to tell them to go away. Each time, his mannerisms become, well...
Now, I thought I already done told y'all to get off my property, okay? So if y'all want to get crazy, we can get crazy. Now, the cops are already on their way.
He wears a facade of poor working-class blackness to be more frightening to the people standing in his driveway, because that's what would scare him. This is a well that Jordan Peele has gone to before. In his film Keanu, he and his comedy partner Keegan-Michael Key, while playing a pair of middle-class black men trying to blend in with a group of gang members, put on a similarly exaggerated persona.
You niggas in the right place?
Yeah, we in the right place, nigga!
See these guys? This is Yuckmouth and Numbskull. They're the hip-hop duo known as Loonies who perform I Got Five on It. They are from a very different world than Gabe. Hell, Numbskull spent 7 years in prison. Gabe would likely cross the road to avoid these guys, but he'll happily consume the art they produce. These people only exist to Gabe when it's convenient for him. Otherwise, it's his rich white friends and his summer home for him. So you have a situation where your life is built on the backs of an underclass that you would rather not even think about, who doesn't have a voice and who has to toil underneath you while being vaguely aware of the comfort and security that you live in. So the anxiety that home invasion films play off is simple. What if they decided one day to do something about it? Normally, these manifest as isolated acts of violence. A small group will decide to terrorize this one specific family for some small vengeance. But in Us, it's not a single random act of violence. Us doesn't ask, what if they decided to do something about it? Us asks, what if the entire underclass realized their situation and that resentment boiled over at the exact same time? The underground doppelgangers in Us don't randomly lash out at affluent families. They all march up from the underground at once to kill their surface counterpart. It's organized. It's not a random act of terrorism, it's a revolution. We expect to sympathize with the surface people over the monstrous, strange-acting underground doppelgangers, but as the film unfolds, it becomes impossible not to see how these people fully view themselves as the good guys. And to some degree, we sympathize with that view, because while they are bringing terrible violence to the surface people, they are also the victims of terrible violence. To stab a person in the neck with a comically large pair of scissors, I think anyone would agree that is violence. Would we say it's violence to lock somebody underground and force them to live off of raw meat? Probably. What about when it's not an individual doing it to another individual? When an economic system requires an underclass who are locked underground living off of raw meat? Is that violence? What if they're not underground? Is creating the conditions that guarantee somebody will die indirectly really that different from killing them personally? Why is it so easy to write off certain forms of violence as the way of the world, while other kinds of violence demand justice? Both the tethered and the surface people share some responsibility for the mass slaughter that occurs throughout the film. Firstly, the revolution of the tethered is misguided. Adelaide's original surface counterpart wears a shirt for the Hands Across America charity event. The idea was to raise money to fight hunger and homelessness by getting millions of people to pay $10 to secure their place in a massive line of people holding hands. They did raise several million and got quite a few people to come out, though the logistical challenges of actually forming a human chain across the United States proved pretty insurmountable. But most importantly, people are still hungry, still homeless. It was a spectacle, certainly an opportunity to help millions of people feel like they were helping, and I'm sure the money they raised did materially help a lot of people, at least temporarily. But a large sum of it also ended up in the pocket of the CEO. But no amount of fundraising can address the economic system that creates poverty in the first place. It's an individualistic solution to a systemic problem. It takes more than dumping the occasional lump sum into a pot to feed people to actually prevent people going hungry in the long term. It's a non-solution that carries the aesthetic of solving a problem. Kind of like killing the entire middle class because they live in relative comfort to you, while leaving the actual system and the state that upholds it completely untouched. It won't put an end to the capitalist state and the interests behind it that actually create an oppressed underground caste. If you fixate on bad individuals rather than the system that puts you both in the roles you're in, your revolution won't meaningfully change society. You'll have only succeeded in taking out some of your personal enemies, and you'll be remembered for a bloodbath, not for changing the world. Your goal cannot simply be to take the place of the people above you on the pyramid. You need to tear down the pyramid. Likewise, the middle class who live in relative comfort did nothing to prevent themselves being positioned as the true enemies of the underclass, and in fact were far more interested in their own wealth and proximity to even greater wealth than the suffering of anyone below them. Gabe spends more time obsessing about the things his richer white friends have than he does even noticing his wife's increasing discomfort as the vacation rolls on. During the finale, when Adelaide faces off against her doppelganger, Red, and we learn that Adelaide was originally born underground and attacked the original surface Adelaide and switched places with her, Red says, "You could have taken me with you. Imagine what could have been." Well, let's imagine. Imagine if the people on the surface had to look into their own eyes and know that they are living on the back of people's misery. Imagine if the tethered and the people of the surface could have worked together, found a way to break the invisible bonds that keep half of them living in misery. Would this have played out differently in a world where this underclass was not made to be invisible? A world where they weren't ignored, where they had a voice? A world where the people on the surface simply could not live in blissful ignorance of the suffering that exists as a consequence of their luxurious lives. Maybe in that world, a solution could have been reached that didn't require half the population to die. But instead, Adelaide only wanted access to the wealth that her people were being kept from. So she left them all to suffer underground for her own enrichment. Does that sound familiar? I can't help but read Us as a warning to the demographic normally targeted by home invasion films, that there are people who toil so that you can live in comfort. Stop ignoring them. Their silence will only turn into resentment. Stop casting them as inhuman monsters out to do nothing but hurt your family. Or monsters is what they will become. Start listening to what they have to say, even if it's inconvenient for you, or they will eventually conclude that getting through to you with words is no longer an option. You have more in common with them than you do with the far wealthier people who truly benefit from this system. Heed these warnings. Otherwise, well, you notice how they're all wearing red?